sent you and give us our $400. So I'm just gonna thank you again, Governor. So, David Kotok, who you heard from earlier today, is going to make a presentation to us on a book he wrote called The Fed and the Flu. We all heard from him last year, and we're going to hear from him again right now. You sure you want to? Okay. Yes, no problem.
So first, to observe all protocols. So let's say all protocols observed, and I have 3 copies of my new book, The Fed and the Flu, that I would like to present to 2 central bankers who are here and the representative of the university. So please permit me. I remember part of it. Thank you. It's a pleasure. Marco, I promised this last year. I promised John. It took me a year long. We deliver. I'll be brief. Jill Fernito said, "You'll have 15 minutes." And I said, in 15 minutes, I won't reach the comma. But I'll try. The book project, The Fed and the Flu, is an undertaking of nearly 5 years. And this is the first official announcement. It was released on February 12th. And it's available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and in all types of settings. The genesis of the book, I have 3 wonderful co-authors. Without them, the book wouldn't exist. But the genesis of the book started with some work in a paper written by 3 economists at the Federal Reserve Bank in San Francisco. And they published very early in the COVID period. And in that period, we didn't know very much about the pandemic. You think about the fact that America woke up to the pandemic in March of 2020. This paper was published in June. They didn't start writing it in June. And Christine and I are sitting in our condominium apartment in Florida, wiping cardboard boxes off as they're delivering dinner to our front door. And I read the paper, and I read the paper 3 times. And I said, you know, in my lifetime, I've read 10,000 research papers. And 99% of the research papers end with, more research is needed. Every once in a while, there's a spark, an aha moment. And as I read their paper, I said, they're on to something. So I proceeded then to read their entire bibliography. What are you going to do? You're locked up in an apartment, afraid to go anywhere. And that was the catalyst for the book. The book started out narrowly focused. But what we found in the book, as we did deeper dives beyond their research paper, which encompassed 19 pandemics over 600-700 years, using the database in the Bank of England. What they discovered is after every epidemic, pandemic, plague, there is a consistent outcome. And we started to work on that. And the fact is, a pandemic, an epidemic, plague is a unique shock. It's not a tsunami, it's not a hurricane, it's not a war. It has its own characteristics, unlike any of the other shocks. And here's an example. What happens to the natural rate of interest in a pandemic? After a pandemic, which has a long shadow, it's not just the immediate, it goes down. That's not true of other types of shocks. What happens to real wages? There's a difference between a war and a pandemic. And we see this over and over in economic metrics. So in the book, you will find an entire chapter with charts and descriptions. One of my co-authors is Mike England. Some here may know his work. He is the principal at Action Economics, and he has been publishing a subscription series of long duration. And working with Mike, we used his entire database and chart system to tell the story of the pandemic before, during, and until we cut off the book. We started with the 19 episodes and researched every one of them, but we had a head start because we had the work of the wonderful researchers at the San Francisco Fit. We expanded the list to a maximum list of 314 epidemics, plagues, or pandemics in the recorded history of the human being on the planet. And then we narrowed those down, and so the book covers 3,800 years of history. Antiquity, after the Dark Ages, modern times, and there's an entire long section devoted to the Federal Reserve. We found behaviors throughout history. They repeat and repeat. Nothing is new about the reactions to COVID, the disinformation, the misbehavior. It's happened since the Justinian plague at the end of the Roman Empire or the plague in Athens in Greece. It was an interesting journey for me. It's one thing to read the Peloponnesian War when you're a student. First of all, you don't want to read it. Secondly, you say, I have to go through all this. And you're 25 years old or 20 years old, and it's assigned to you. I don't know even if it is anymore, but it's another thing to write a book and have to go do research on the plague in Athens. As a matter of fact, I had to reread the Peloponnesian War with 2 separate translations. And they don't say the same thing, which is typical of investigations in antiquity. Behavior didn't change throughout the history of man in every language, everywhere. And it hasn't changed in COVID either. The shock we tend to measure in deaths. That's our nature. So pandemics, epidemics, plagues were categorized by how many people died. There's more to it than that, because you impact life expectancy, the demographic shift. Someone earlier, I think, listed the 5 Ds. One of them was the power of demographics. So if you take a demographic trend, and in the United States, we have wonderful data. In most modern countries we do now, we have a demographic trend. We can say, geez, we know how many people were born. We know how many people are dying. We know how old they are. We know their distribution. And you shock that system, which otherwise is on a trajectory that has been depended upon year after year after year after year without much variation. And now you impose this huge shock. In the United States, in my opinion, America failed. There's one of the reasons. More importantly is, how do you measure the full extent of it? I don't want to finger point which politician failed, which government agency failed. That's a debate that continues to rage anywhere in the world where such discussions take place. I just want to put up a slide. That's our story. The richest country in the world, and that's where we stand on life expectancy. It speaks for itself. How do you know who died of COVID? For 6 weeks, in 6 northern counties in the state of Florida, where we live, when COVID was raging, there were no COVID deaths. They were all listed as something else. So when you look at the statistics in the 6 counties, you don't see any dead people from COVID. What do you see instead? A spike of people dying of pneumonia. Why? A medical examiner, somebody, a coroner, somebody had to designate a cause of death. So in early COVID, we have estimates of how many people die, but we don't know how many COVID deaths there were. So how do we do this? We project expected deaths based on demographics, and then we see more than there's supposed to be. That's what it looks like. In the United States, approximately total cumulative excess deaths from COVID to date, remember, it's not over, are approximately 3 million, and our official number is about half that much. How do you impact and measure the full impact of a pandemic, epidemic, plague? Well, if you have people who die and you can estimate above trend how many there are, and you learn some things about them, more of them were older, we learn things about them. But what about people who are disabled from long COVID? In researching for the book, where we were going through antiquity, we think we identified the first case of long COVID. It was in Roman times after the first plague, the Antonine plague, and it was Aristides who delivered a famous oration, got sick from the disease, and didn't die. But he remained disabled for the last 15 years of his life from the plague. That was the plague that was the first round that decimated Rome. So I think Aristides was a great orator, and he's the first record. 5 minutes? See, I'm almost at the comma. First record of a long COVID disability, a post-infection disabled person. In the United States today, we have somewhere between 7 and 9 on the low end, 15, 17 on the high end, million people with some version of long COVID disability. Christine and I know 2 of them personally. How did it happen? All of a sudden, post-COVID, the hearing on one side disappeared. Just like that. It was a neurological response, which is now being documented in post-long COVID cases. And what happens? You're sitting, you get up in the morning, and out of your left ear, you can't hear. What do? Do you immediately go to an ENT and say, I lost my hearing, I had COVID last year, I have some maybe neurological symptoms, and if you give me the steroid in the next 4 hours, you can save some of my hearing? Is that what you do at breakfast? at 9 o'clock in the morning? No. First, you wait to see what happens. And then 3 days later, you still don't hear out of that ear. And so then you go make an appointment to see somebody. And by the time you see the somebody, you're deaf in one ear. That's a COVID disability. We know personally 2 such cases. And those of us who gather in the GIC and who gathered in Maine at the gathering we have know one of them in this room. What's the next thing that happens? So, disabled. This one was loss of hearing. The versions of post-COVID, long COVID disability are 100-fold. What's the next thing that happens? You go get a hearing aid, and the hearing aid takes the sound from this side and routes it over to this side. And you're hearing on one side. Now you have the technology to get the sound over there to hear it, but you have to make a quality adjustment in your life. So what we do in some intricate mathematical ways is we estimate disability, life lost, and convert it to what it would be if it were years, and quality adjustment, life lost, converted to years, and we add that to the excess deaths. And we come up with a number. And we say, if we really cut COVID off today, what would be the shock? How many million deaths would it actually be if we counted everything accurately? And we derive an estimate. And the only thing we know about an estimate in economics is it's wrong the minute you make it. But you have a sense the size of the shock. So I will skip details at the end of these slides and invite you to find them all in the book. But I want to say a word about the Federal Reserve. I don't know what happened. There goes the Federal Reserve. No, they're back. Okay. In our book, there's an entire section from the creation of the Fed, before it existed, when the first name club went to Jekyll Island and secretively started to plan the Central Bank of the United States. That was over a century ago. In that club were people whose international business experience included business exposure, which had exposure to the Russian flu, which killed over 100,000 in the UK a few years before the Fed was a twinkle in their eye before it was actually created. They had business experience of a pandemic. The Russian flu was 1899 to 1905, something like that. The beginning of the creation of the Fed with Senator Aldrich and J.P. Morgan and others was in that window of time, and then it was motivated to let's get this done because of the banking crisis in 1907. So we got a Federal Reserve. Wonderful. 1913, we have a Fed. 1914, it goes into business. The Spanish flu rages. 3 years later, 4 years later, it's spread by the war. The Fed is a very patriotic institution. It's brand new. So it's helpful in trying to sell a war bond or promote the defense of the United States. If we examine the minutes of the Fed in the window of time in the very early Fed, and there are discussions of credit and business conditions, there's no mention of the Spanish flu. In Philadelphia, on one day, 12,000 people died because of a cytokine storm of reaction to that particular pathogen. The mention isn't there. In New York, in the minutes of the New York Fed, very little discussion. There was discussion about a credit problem. Well, of course you got a credit problem. You got people dead and their businesses failing. And the decision in New York was we should open the discount window for the federal banks, but not the state chartered banks. That's in the minutes of the New York Fed. That I don't fault the Fed. This was a brand new institution. We go into the rest of the history of the Fed. 1957, Asian flu. McChesney Martin, very strict banker. Followed in the late 60s by the Hong Kong flu. The Fed started to pay attention seriously 30 years before COVID. The research papers started to be done. This is an economic shock, too. Now, there's indications from reading the research that was done in the Fed that in 2003, when SARS looked like it was going to explode, the Federal Reserve was preparing itself. It didn't have to use the tools it did during COVID. In my opinion, there is a debate. The United States avoided a repeat of a Great Depression, and it did so because of the actions of the central bank. They were going to make damn sure it would not happen. And by the time that we confronted COVID, they had the history, they had a roadmap of tools. They used some, not effectively, because this was a trial under fire. And not only did it save the economy of the United States, it saved the rest of the world. So, new book, The Fed and the Flu, took us 4.5 years. Has about 100 graphics and charts. And there will be a quiz on it tomorrow in the roundtable. And I hope you enjoy it, and I thank you for 15 minutes. Thank you, Jim.